Harriet woke up with a knot in her stomach, nerves twisting more than they ever had before one of her children's birthdays. She kept reminding herself this was just a routine 8-year-old party, streamers, sugary cake, party hats. Yet an undercurrent of apprehension tightened her shoulders. The sense of foreboding had first surfaced a week ago when she found the clown's business card tucked in the space between her windshield and the wiper. It arrived out of nowhere. Yet it was exactly what she was looking for. Every year, she scoured the city to find unique entertainment for Katie, her youngest daughter, and this time a clown act seemed ideal. And indeed, from the phone call, the clown sounded cheerful. He called himself Corky and boasted of a comedic charm guaranteed to make the kids scream with delight. Something in his voice, however, had made Harriet's skin prickle, but she put that feeling aside. Katie loved clowns, after all. Now, Harriet stepped into the living room and inspected the last details. Multicolored balloons were taped high on the walls, a large piñata dangled precariously from the ceiling's central fixture, and polka-dot tablecloths brightened the furniture. Light poured in through the wide windows, pushing back any sense of shadow. She tried to ignore the memory from last night, that odd moment just before bed when she'd gazed outside and seen something or someone standing in the garden. The figure's mouth cracked into a grin. She'd blinked, and it was gone. The neighborhood was safe, she told herself. Her mind was only playing tricks on her due to the stress of planning a child's birthday. The doorbell jingled right after noon. The day's first guests had arrived. Neighbors, classmates, parents, Katie's friends. Harriet exchanged polite greetings, ushered them in, and set children to playing. Katie, wearing a bright pink dress, ran in circles through the house, a cluster of giggling children at her heels. Harriet felt her tension lift temporarily as laughter and squeals replaced the hush of her own anxious thoughts. She poured juice into little cups, cut fruit, and watched the hours slip by with typical party chaos. When Corky finally arrived, he was earlier than scheduled. Harriet heard the second ring of the doorbell but was busy in the kitchen. By the time she wiped her hands and hurried to the hall, Katie was already at the doorway, staring enthralled at this lanky figure with a painted red smile. Corky wore a colorful patchwork suit, big yellow shoes, and a jester's hat with small bells that jingled any time he moved. In the one hand, he clutched a bunch of helium balloons. His face paint was thick and had a geometric pattern that stretched from the corners of his lips toward his ears, casting a perpetual grin. Harriet apologized for not getting there sooner, but Corky just bowed in an exaggerated manner and introduced himself to Katie. His voice was surprisingly soft, almost a whisper that brushed against Harriet's eardrums. She shivered, glimpsing for a moment the sallow tone of the skin around his eyes, before he hopped cheerfully forward, leading Katie and her friends to the living room with comedic leaps. Harriet forced a laugh, determined not to let herself be unnerved by something as trivial as face paint. The children gathered around Corky in a half moon, squealing with curiosity. Anne, Harriet's oldest daughter, at 12, watched from the edge of the room with pursed lips, clearly unimpressed. Corky began his act by juggling brightly colored balls. His movements were unexpectedly graceful. The children clapped. Harriet found herself applauding too, noticing that the clown's limbs moved with mesmerizing fluidity. He sequentially added more objects. A plastic doll, a cup, and even the squeaky toy from the dog's basket, until he was juggling 4, 5, 6 items. Laughter rolled through the house. Harriet felt the last of her anxiety ease. She told herself she'd just been overreacting. Then came the balloon animals. Corky's jokes were silly and heavy on puns, but he timed them so that laughter shot through the audience constantly. Every move was accompanied by a jingle of bells. But Harriet's gaze was drawn to his face, where each smile seemed to stretch too widely, each tilt of the head slow in a way that didn't look quite natural. Once, Harriet could have sworn she saw his pupils flourish into a bottomless black expanse for just a moment when he looked at Katie. But then he blinked, and the eyes were normal. She shook her head, blaming the weird flicker of light. After a lively chorus of applause, Corky declared it was time for a game. He traipsed to the center of the living room, swirling his arms as he explained the rules of pin the smile on the clown. He handed out paper smiles on small clips to the children, telling them to try and attach them to a large clown face drawn on a poster. Grinning widely, he ferried each blindfolded child to the poster while humming a tuneless melody. Each time a child pinned a smile in the wrong spot, he uttered an elongated, "Oh no," feigning heartbreak. The children ate it up, giggling and squealing. Harriet felt uneasy. She glanced at her watch, hoping the scheduled showtime might be nearing an end. It happened during the pinning game. One child, Toby, stumbled with the blindfold on and accidentally stepped on Corky's foot. The clown let a high-pitched yelp slip out. It was sharp, almost a hiss through the throat. The giggling children turned silent all at once, thrown off by the abrupt break in Corky's pleasant facade. Even Harriet's heart jumped. Corky froze, turned stiffly, and Harriet saw his painted grin tremble. She expected him to brush it off with a joke, but the silence drew out. Katie stepped forward, arms folded behind her back. "Corky, are you okay?" For a fraction of a second, Harriet thought the clown would lunge forward and scream in the child's face. But instead, Corky let out a shrill laugh, one that made skin crawl. "We wouldn't I be," he said, although his voice was no longer soft. It had dropped into a keyed-up pitch. The wide, painted smile on his face looked forced. The moment broke as Corky jingled the bells on his hat. The children returned to half-hearted giggles. Harriet decided it was time to cut the cake, so she made an announcement. Corky's act was only meant to be half an hour, and he'd already been there for nearly 45 minutes. As Harriet led the children into the kitchen, Corky slipped behind them, seemingly content to follow. She felt him behind her, felt his eyes on the back of her head. She pushed open the kitchen door, flipping on the overhead lights. The big birthday cake sat in the center of the table with "Happy Birthday, Katie" in shiny pink icing. Katie's friends pressed in around the table as Harriet started to light the candles. That's when she realized Corky was standing uncomfortably close, so close she could hear the slow intake of his breaths. "Why don't you take a seat?" Harriet suggested, trying to maintain a bright tone. "We appreciate your performance, but we're going to eat now. You're free to stay for some cake if you like." The clown's lips stayed curled in that stretched grin. He lowered his voice, though Harriet still heard him clearly. "I prefer not to sit. I enjoy seeing the children's joy. You'll give me nourishment." Harriet blinked, trying to process that. "Excuse me?" He crooked his head so his bells jingled softly. "Cake, I mean. I do like cake." She forced a nod, then turned away, resolving to get through the cake ceremony quickly. It became challenging to keep up her usual motherly cheer. Something about this clown felt fundamentally wrong. She caught a glimpse of Anne, who seemed to be reading her mother's unease. That moment of silent accord between them made Harriet feel slightly better and more resolved to keep the children safe. They lit the candles, sang the birthday song, and Katie beamed from cheek to cheek. For a few moments, Harriet forgot her worries, focusing on the sweet glow of her daughter with her friends singing in unison. Katie blew out the candles. Laughter erupted, and Harriet sighed with relief. Then she looked up and saw Corky's face at the fringe of the group. He was staring with wide, unblinking eyes, almost as if he were absorbing the laughter in the room. His chest heaved with shallow breaths. Harriet saw Toby, the boy who had stumbled into him, shrink away to the other side of the table. The clown noticed and gave Toby the briefest flash of a smile, a tiny upward twitch of the corners of his mouth before the face returned to the bigger grin. Harriet noticed with a jolt that the corners of Corky's lips were cracking, the face paint chipping, as though the grin were literally pulling at his skin. While the children devoured cake, Harriet pulled the clown aside. "I think we're all set here," she said, trying to keep her tone level. "Thank you for entertaining the children. You've done a wonderful job. Here's your payment." She pulled some bills from her jeans pocket. She tried to smile but couldn't muster the warmth. "The kids need to start their next activity." Corky's eyes flicked over the money and he smiled wider. "Yes, wonderful," he intoned, but made no move to reach for it. He seemed preoccupied by the sounds of the children's voices. Harriet insisted, pressing the money toward him, but he wouldn't take it. "All of this laughter," Corky breathed. "You have no idea what it's worth. So fresh, so bright. Yes!" He dragged out the sibilance, letting it hiss unnervingly. Bells tinkled as he tilted his chin downward, focusing on Toby again, who was pressing around the group for a second slice of cake. Harriet froze. "Take your money," she said, steel in her voice. "We're done here." Her heart hammered. She realized she stood with her back to the door, inadvertently blocking it. Corky's grin quivered into something savage. The lines of his clown paint were flaking, as if something was pushing from underneath, trying to break through that bright veneer. Harriet felt an inexplicable wave of revulsion. He made a subtle gesture with one hand, as though smoothing an invisible ripple in the air. Her vision swam, and everything around her seemed to brighten. The laughter of children growing shriller, sharper, and then Harriet felt a flash of cold. She gasped. Corky leaned forward slightly, letting out a chuckle low enough that only she could hear. "You think I need money?" he murmured. "You only teased my appetite." She swallowed, forcing herself to remain calm. "You need to go," she repeated, voice shaking. "Now." At that moment, Toby walked around the table, still munching cake, and joined Katie. The kids started a new round of giggles. Harriet's mind screamed, "This clown is fixated on laughter, this entity wanting to feed on it somehow." She considered passing it off as her own paranoia, but the feeling was as real as the ground beneath her feet. Corky straightened, taking 2 steps toward the kids. Harriet lurched forward to intercept, but she felt a wave of vertigo. From the corner of her eye, she saw Anne running toward them. The older daughter had been standing on the sidelines, eyes peeled on Corky with dread. She placed herself between the clown and Katie. "Mom? What's going on?" Anne demanded, voice trembling. Corky shot Anne a quick glare that made Harriet's stomach twist. He seemed to be sizing her up as an obstacle. Softly he cooed. "Anne, is it? Oh, I see so much of your mother in you, both so protective, so serious." He licked his lips, or the smear of red paint that shaped them, and Harriet had to clamp down on an urge to gag, because for a second she imagined she saw something behind that painted flesh, a slithering black mass. Panic flared through the room. Some of the children noticed Harriet's distress. Others began picking up on the tension, and even small children can sense when something is deeply wrong. Drifting fear replaced laughter, and as though that fear was physically palpable, Corky's painted grin began to crack further. He let out a shriek of frustration, but it was more like the wail of something primal. Before Harriet or Anne could react, Corky lifted his fingers and snapped them in a single violent motion. The balloons around the room popped in a sudden cascade of deafening blasts. The overhead lights flickered, then went out. The children screamed. Harriet scrambled blindly for the light switch. The hallway outside was still dimly lit by midday sun, but the kitchen had grown unnaturally dark. In that gloom, Harriet saw Corky's face. The paint was peeling away, revealing patches of grayish flesh. His mouth, the painted red grin, looked like it had torn. There was something beneath, a black chasm of swirling darkness, flickering like living shadow. Harriet felt her throat constrict. Katie screamed. Toby sprinted away, colliding with the wide sliding door that led to the backyard. Several other kids tumbled in confusion and terror. Harriet reached out to steady them. She heard a wet, clicking sound, like an insect's mandibles, come from the clown. The bells on his jester's hat rattled ominously. Anne, still in front of her mother, shouted, "Stay back!" Harriet wanted to calm her, but she realized they had to rally the children. The top priority was to get them out, away from the clown. She shouted, "Everybody outside, now!" She herded the children toward the door. Corky gave a disjointed laugh, as if multiple voices coughed through his throat at once. He advanced 2 paces, fast as a hunched predator. Harriet's heart thudded in her chest. She saw Toby manage to open the sliding door, bright sunlight spilling in. Some of the children dashed into the backyard, but not all. The clown was forcibly seizing the moment, using the darkness, stepping in front of a few trembling kids. Gradually, laughter had turned to terrified sobbing. Harriet realized that he was losing his hold. The children no longer laughed. It starved him. He wanted that laughter back. "Smiles! We need smiles!" Corky thundered, a savage edge in his voice. "Don't cry, laughter! Laughter!" The last words were shrieked as though he might physically force the children to be happy. The incongruity of it was monstrous. Harriet lunged to gather the last few kids, while Anne confronted the clown directly with wide yet defiant eyes. "Stop it!" Anne screamed. She looked over her shoulder at Harriet. "Get them out! Hurry!" Harriet scooped Katie and ushered her outside, passing Toby and 2 other children. The fresh air felt like a balm, but leading the children into daylight also left Anne alone for a terrifying heartbeat. Harriet spun just in time to see Corky lash out with a pale hand. He grabbed Anne's wrist, coiling his fingers around it. Harriet's throat went dry. "Anne?" Before Harriet could rush back in, the clown wrenched Anne close. In the half-light, Harriet witnessed Corky's face convulse, the grin turning into a ragged slash across his cheeks. Painted flakes floated down. The darkness under the clown's skin writhed. Harriet's mind struggled to comprehend it. She heard a hiss, a moan, something that almost formed words. Anne twisted, kneeing the clown in the stomach. He staggered, letting out a shriek from that black abyss in his mouth. For a split second, Harriet's relief soared and might get free. Then Corky's eyes bore into Harriet's, shining a malevolent gleam. Harriet felt disoriented, fighting a sudden wave of dizziness as she stepped forward, ready to do anything to save her daughter. From behind Harriet came help in the form of an unexpected ally. Harriet's neighbor, Mr. Dunbar, who had accompanied his nephew to the party. He must have seen the chaos from outside. He rushed in, flicked on a flashlight from his pocket, and aimed the beam into Corky's face. The clown shrieked, dropping Anne. Distracted, he stumbled backward, his bells jingling in a macabre counterpoint to the children's cries. The darkness retreated a fraction. Harriet seized Anne's hand, pulling her away. The moment Harriet and Anne reached the threshold, Corky lunged again, scraping at the air as though trying to reclaim them. But Harriet slammed the sliding door shut, locking it. She scrambled outside, hugging Anne, heart pounding as though it might burst. She tried to call for calm, urging parents to herd the children farther away from the house. Most kids were sobbing, half in shock, clinging to one another in small clusters on the lawn. Harriet spotted 2 other parents quickly gathering them. That's when Harriet froze, hearing what sounded like faint, rattling laughter coming from within the kitchen. She felt the glass vibrate under her palm. Corky was still inside. "Call the police!" Harriet yelled, voice ragged. Mr. Dunbar whipped out his phone, stepping aside to dial. Harriet took in the bizarre scene. The day was still bright, yet her home, especially the kitchen windows, seemed veiled with an unsettling gloom, as if the sun no longer wished to shine on those panes. She heard sirens in the far distance and prayed they'd arrive quickly. Then the glass rattled again with a violent tremor. Harriet and Anne, standing just outside, recognized the shape behind it. Corky raising a clenched fist. He pounded the glass once, spiderweb cracks appearing instantly. Harriet backed away. "Get the children," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Move them across the street." Mr. Dunbar nodded, already ushering them to safety. Harriet hesitated, drawn between fear and a gut-churning sense of responsibility. Should she leave the entire house with that thing inside, or stand guard and risk the clown's wrath? She steeled herself, picking up a broken piece of garden stake left by the fence. A makeshift weapon, but better than nothing. Anne gripped her mother's arm. "Mom, don't go in there. Wait for the police." But Harriet's instincts, the maternal drive that had been fueling her all day, insisted she couldn't entirely abandon the home. She needed to ensure no child was left behind. "Just wait here," she told Anne, though she knew it was a tall order for a terrified 12-year-old. Carefully, Harriet crept to a side window and peered in, stake in hand. The kitchen lights flickered, randomly surging before dimming out again. She saw the faint shape of Corky, hunched over the table. The clown was trembling, face turned away from the window. Something horrifying was happening to that painted skin. Harriet watched in revulsion as small lumps pitched upward beneath the clown costume, as though multiple insect-like limbs were growing from inside. The shape convulsed, letting out a garbled whimper. Then, stuttering in half-formed words, Corky rasped, "No, more." Laughter. No more feed. Harriet realized he'd consumed the children's happiness up to a point, but now that they were out of reach, all that remained was fear and panic, forcing his true nature to the surface. The monstrous entity was unraveling without the children's laughter to sustain it. For a moment, Harriet was filled not just with terror, but a strange pity. This thing seemed shaped by hunger, forced to adopt a garish facade to feast on the delight of unsuspecting children. But pity gave way to survival instinct. She needed to confirm the house was clear and keep it contained until help arrived. She eased away from the window, uncertain how to approach. The sirens were much closer now, but still not on her street. She took a deep breath, preparing to circle around to the front door, when she heard glass shatter from within. Corky was moving. Harriet sprinted around the side of the house. She nearly collided with Toby, who was also holding a wooden stick. He must have come around from the backyard, ignoring the directives to stay away. The boy's face was tear-streaked, yet he seemed determined. Harriet placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "Toby, no, you shouldn't be here, get back." Too late. A shape burst through the front window in a crash of broken shards. Corky spilled out onto the front yard. Sunlight seemed to shrivel him, scorching away the bright clown paint as though it were alive and writhing. The shards of color sloughed off in chunks. In the midday glare, Harriet barely recognized the figure that rose shakily to its feet. Its clothes were tattered, those lumps beneath the fabric shifting. The face had caved in on itself. 2 black orbs where eyes should be, and a wide slash of a mouth that quivered, drooling some sort of black substance. Harriet's mind could hardly process it. Some primal aversion screamed at her to run. Toby dropped his stick, stumbling back. He gave a choked cry. Corky pivoted toward the boy, hissing in unearthly vocalization. Harriet lunged in front of Toby, brandishing her stake. Corky advanced, though unsteady, the shadows under his eroding costume twisting. Harriet shouted, "Stay away!" The creature cocked its head in the same comedic tilt it had done before, only now it was a grotesque mockery of that clownish persona. Its mouth parted in a rictus grin. Then, from that twisted hole, a raspy voice croaked. "Laugh. Need laughter." A wave of fear jolted Harriet so strongly she struggled to breathe. Another swirl of dizziness threatened to buckle her knees, some remnant of the clown's ability to distort emotions, she guessed. She forced herself to remain upright. "No one's laughing for you anymore," she said, mustering all the resolve in her quivering voice. In a burst of frantic movement, Corky lunged. Harriet swung the stake, managing to crack it across the clown's side. There was a mushy, hollow sound that made Harriet's stomach turn. Corky reared back, letting out a hiss. Black fluid seeped from the tear in his patchwork suit. Toby stumbled away, calling Harriet's name. She backpedaled, stake still in hand, ensuring Corky wouldn't pass her toward Toby. The creature showed no blood, just thick, oily darkness sliding over its gray skin. The sirens' wailing grew so loud, Harriet felt them thrumming in her bones. Then the police car rounded the corner. The clown flicked its head toward the approaching lights. Harriet watched a flicker of dread cross the remnants of that inhuman face. Perhaps Corky realized it couldn't defeat a group of armed adults, or that sunrise itself might be lethal for it. The grin slackened, and Harriet felt a sudden tension break, as though a thick rope had snapped. Corky emitted a trembling wheeze, then abruptly lurched away, bounding off in a wild, four-limbed scramble. Harriet gave chase for 2 steps before she realized the futility. It disappeared behind a hedge, leaving black smears along the ground. By the time the police arrived, the clown was gone. Only a trail of glistening black fluid and fragments of bright fabric were left behind. Harriet stood panting, stake clutched in her shaking hand. Toby clung to her shirt. One of the officers rushed over, bewildered by the scene. The shattered window, the trembling woman and boy, the remains of children's party decorations scattered across the lawn. Another officer went to calm the children across the street, who were being looked after by Mr. Dunbar and a few other parents. Harriet's head spun. She tried to explain in halting words. A clown who had attacked, something monstrous beneath the face paint. Then paramedics arrived, calming the frantic children, placing layered blankets around them. Questions were hurled at Harriet, but she could barely answer. She could only repeat that an entity masquerading as a clown had threatened them. In the moments when Harriet had collected herself enough to speak clearly, she looked the officer in the eyes and said, "He came for their laughter. He was feeding off it?" Of course, the officer wore the polite smile of someone trying not to show skepticism. Harriet gave no further justification. It was the only explanation that felt right, no matter how insane it sounded. Within the hour, the paramedics had assessed the children. A few bruises and scratches, cuts from broken glass, but thankfully no life-threatening injuries. Parents huddled together, hugging their children, uncertain how to explain away this nightmare. Katie refused to let go of Harriet's waist. Anne hovered close, arms folded, eyes scanning the horizons as if worried that Corky would reappear at any moment. Harriet understood that feeling. She, too, couldn't stop searching the periphery of her vision. After giving her statement to the police, Harriet stood near the edge of her driveway. She spotted something bright amidst the trampled grass. Kneeling carefully, she found the clown's business card, timeless white with a single painted red grin across the center. She'd never noticed that detail before. Corky the Clown read the words scrawled beneath. On the back, the phone number was now smudged black, and Harriet dared not touch the spreading stain. At last, police and paramedics began to disperse, and the parents quietly guided their children home. Harriet tried to salvage some semblance of normalcy for Katie, but the child only stared blankly, while refusing to speak. Anne hovered protectively, occasionally gazing at Harriet to make sure her mother was all right. Harriet wondered if things could ever feel normal again. How did one forget? She had glimpsed the raw face of a predator that fed on innocent joy. By early evening, the once vibrant living room was stripped of decoration. Shattered glass and broken balloons littered the floor. The remains of the birthday party felt like relics of a distant past. Harriet couldn't bear to look at the clown paraphernalia. She stored the few leftover props in a garbage bag, except for the ones that were too badly stained or torn. It stunned her how quickly everything could change, how an ordinary day could become a horrific memory. Before bed, Harriet checked on Katie, slept fitfully, hugging a stuffed rabbit. Anne was awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. Harriet sat down beside her oldest daughter, brushing hair from the girl's damp forehead. They didn't speak for a while. Eventually, Anne asked in a timid voice, "Mom, do you think it's gone?" Harriet didn't know how to answer. There was no guarantee that creature had vanished for good. Yet Harriet tried to sound reassuring. "We're safe tonight," she murmured. "We'll watch over each other. We'll be ready." After Anne closed her eyes, Harriet slipped away into the hallway. She retreated to her own bedroom, leaning against the closed door, exhaustion crashing over her in a tidal wave. Every muscle in her body felt strung out, tension that refused to ease. She recalled Corky's last words as the clown attacked. Laugh. Need laughter. Harriet's stomach churned with the memory. She prayed that the entity's inability to feed, combined with the bright daylight, had forced it to flee forever. A small voice deep in her mind, though, whispered that it might only bide its time, searching for the next source of childish glee, the next group of unsuspecting kids to devour. She bit down on her lower lip to keep from trembling. Eventually, Harriet tiptoed over to the window. It was quiet outside. Street lamps hummed, and tall shapes of hedges lay still, undisturbed. No sign of a hunched figure waiting in the dark. Her heart thumped in her ribs as she allowed her gaze to linger, making certain no black-painted grin peered from the foliage. Gradually her muscles loosened, though the memory refused to fade. She turned away from the window and switched off the light. In the darkness, Harriet could only hear the faint rustle of her breath, the distant hush of her children's uneasy sleep. She slid beneath the covers, physically safe yet haunted. She'd remember the clown's cracked facade, that glimpse of raw, writhing hunger overshadowed by bright paint and bells. If she closed her eyes, she could still see the wide smile that wasn't really a smile at all, only a maw demanding laughter. Boldly, Harriet promised herself she would never let that happen again. Laughter, indeed, was precious, and there were beings out there who craved it like ravenous beasts. She closed her eyes but still braced for the slightest shuffle of footsteps, a faint jingle of bells. Sleep would not come easily. The night stretched out, steeped in silent dread, and in that silence, Harriet knew one truth above all. Not everything that wears a smile is a friend in disguise. Sometimes laughter dies when it is devoured by the darkness hidden beneath a painted grin. She wondered if they'd truly driven the clown away, or if its hunger would lead it back, slithering into another unsuspecting child celebration. The only certainty was that for her own children, the notion of a clown had been irrevocably shattered. Perhaps that was the price for surviving.